Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you've had a great day and it's been very informative. So it's my pleasure to be here with you again, in case you tuned in this morning. I am Nancy Maldonado, and I am the President and CEO of Chicano Federation. And today I get to talk to you about a topic, a subject that is near and dear to my heart and my team's heart, and it's all around advocacy, activism, and most importantly, action. And during the time where those terms are kind of thrown around a lot, really we're just going to go through some definitions, really understanding the definitions of the words, but also using some examples of advocacy and activism here in San Diego, specifically during the pandemic, and how that has played out, particularly for Chicano Federation and the work that we've done. So just to give you a little brief history on Chicano Federation and who we are, 51 years ago, Chicano Federation was started as an advocacy organization, really advocating for the rights of Latinos and other people of color around some of the same topics that we're really discussing today, such as police brutality and voter rights. And so when I became the CEO of Chicano Federation, one of the things that I was really inspired by is the history of the organization and the powerful and rich activism of the organization. And it was my intent to bring that back because we do have a lot of social service programs, a lot of which are government funded. And so there was kind of this misconception that we needed to separate the two, that we couldn't be the advocacy organization that we once were because of the funding that we receive and the programs that we have. And so, I was very intentional about bringing on a team that could help me merge the two. And we've done a lot of really great work over the past year, and I'm excited to share some of that with you, but also to share some of the lessons that we've learned and some of the mistakes that we've made, because I think that's equally as important. So, together we'll go through this. I do have a presentation, like I said, with some definitions, but I really would love to hear your questions, your thoughts, or if you've had successes or failures or kind of some bumps in the road on your advocacy and activism journey. I'd love to hear those too. So let's go ahead and get started, and make sure you stay through the whole thing, because there's a really fun surprise for you after this presentation, so don't log off. All right, let's get started. So the title of this is Driving Social Change, Advocacy, Activism, and Action. And again, in a time where we're seeing these words used a lot, it's important to really understand kind of what they mean, particularly in the realm of a nonprofit, right? And what a nonprofit can and can't do in terms of advocacy and activism. And I'm certainly not going to give any legal advice, but like I said, I'm happy to share some of the lessons that we've learned and some of the journey that we've been on over this past year. Next slide. All right, and through here I've woven in some quotes, because I think that are really inspiring to me. So you'll see those throughout the presentation, and I do hope that you'll take some time to kind of reflect on these quotes from some amazing people that I know that we're all inspired by. All right, so I think the question that we discuss internally a lot at Chicano Federation, and that we've discussed a lot with our partners who are on this journey with us, is how can nonprofits drive the change needed for a more just, a more tolerant, healthy, educated, and equitable region? I mean, that's what we all want right now, and what we really are trying to find is the role that nonprofits can play within that, and the role that we can all play as nonprofit leaders and team members in driving that change. And so we would love to hear, again, in the comments or questions, would love to hear your thoughts around how can nonprofits be the force that drives this forward, especially here in San Diego, because there are so many amazing nonprofits here. All right, so some definitions. So social change, right? And the definitions are up, but we can certainly talk through them. So social change is a change in human interaction and relationships that transform culture and social institutions. And I think that there's no better time to talk about this than what we're living through right now. We are living through this movement that is intended for social change and really for transformation. I think that's the goal that we all want, and that's the direction that we're all seeing. And so it's to me, it's a really powerful time to be living through, and these are really important conversations to be having. But as nonprofits and nonprofit leaders, it's really important to really digest and understand the role that we can all play in this moving forward. And so there's a couple of different words that are sometimes used interchangeably, and that's advocacy and activism. So advocacy is public support for or recommendation, I can't really see it that well, of a particular cause or policy. There we go. And again, these are definitions that I pulled off, but obviously these can be, they can vary slightly depending on kind of your definition of each of the words. And activism is efforts to promote, impede, direct, or intervene and reform with the desire to make changes towards a perceived greater good. And obviously, there's a role for each of them, and they're interchangeable in terms of the actions and the things that we're doing. Most organizations that I know or that we partner with don't just do one and not the other. So there's a role for both. There's a role for them to be interchangeable every day in the things that we do, and I'll share some examples of that in a little bit later. Next slide. So social change, the definition are changes that occur over time and often have profound and long-term consequences for society. But the thing that I love about social change and kind of the definition of it is that we have the collective power to influence social change. And I think that sometimes that gets lost, especially with, when things are being thrown at us all the time that are not favorable, we can tend to feel hopeless. But the thing is that social change is possible, and social change is driven by our collective efforts to really push for it. And these, it's relationships, culture, behavior, institutions, social structures, and cultural norms that change as a result of social change movements. And nothing speaks more to that than what we're going through right now in terms of wanting to change structures and systems and wanting reform and transformation versus just some small changes. And then obviously with any social change theory will also include that there has to be, or that there likely is, resistance to that change, especially when people when they have vested interest in maintaining those structures and systems. And so again, we're seeing that very much so in the conversations about police reform or defunding police, is that there is a lot of resistance. And again, it's from people that have a vested interest in maintaining those systems. So and the definition of social change, it includes that it's most often the most powerful when there is resistance, right? Because very few times will we find meaningful changes where there is no resistance. So it's been really interesting to see that on any issue or anything that we're talking about, the opposition and the resistance to that change, and really dissecting that and understanding why there's resistance to any change that we're talking about. Next slide. Advocacy. So as we talked about, it's any action that speaks in favor of or recommends, argues for any causes, supports, or defends or pleads on behalf of others. So active support of a cause with the goal of raising awareness of an issue. So, advocates are defined as expressing their opinions and convictions about specific issues. And we can go ahead and change to the next slide. Oh, there we go. And advocacy is the process of making people's voices heard. And this is the part that I think is the most powerful, and the part that we as nonprofits can play in elevating the voices of our community members so that they have a say in the policies that impact their lives. And they can affect the communities, not just at the local level, but at the state and national levels. And this is something that we have witnessed in the work that we've done, is our community really coming forward to speak on these issues. And it's been really powerful, because I think that one of the things that we, again, going back to that social change, is we have the power to make these changes if collectively we do. And so for the work that we've done, it's been really powerful to see our community get behind these issues that we're advocating for and really come out and speak, and understanding that they have the power to do that. And then obviously it includes helping lawmakers come up with solutions to specific problems, as we mentioned before. So activism, this is the part where the definition is a little bit different, but again, they're so interchangeable, and you can't, you can do one without the other, but they oftentimes cross over. So activism, policy or action of using vigorous campaigning to bring about political or social change, and the practice of using action to achieve a result, such as political demonstration or a strike in support or an opposition of an issue. So, what we're witnessing right now with all of these those marches and protests, this is an example of activism. And it is a practice that emphasizes direct, vigorous action, especially in support of or opposition to one side of a controversial issue. And it was really interesting to me in putting this all together, how much that comes up is that the controversy that has to be there in terms of defining these social movements and the role that the controversy plays, and the investment in maintaining these systems and where the opposition comes from. Next slide. So here's a very interesting definition to me, or kind of the distinction, is that advocates are almost always people-oriented. So advocacy work is almost always on behalf of people, whereas activism is defined as being more action-oriented and is usually set out to create social, political, or legal change. So again, when we talk about kind of the intersection of the two, you can see how they could definitely intersect. But that definitely, definition of an advocacy versus activism stood out to me, as that one is people-oriented versus the other one being action-oriented. All right, next slide. All right, so let's talk about advocacy. Next slide. All right, so when deciding kind of what our advocacy agenda was going to be at Chicano Federation, we did, really look into how is this different from lobbying? What are the restrictions? How can we do this? What questions should we be asking? And really, how is advocacy different from lobbying? Because as we all know, so lobbying is only one kind of advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying, right? So it gets a little convoluted, but one of the things that we really needed to do was educate and inform our organization about the current policies, the problems affecting our community, and make sure that our team was aware of the different issues that were affecting the community that we serve, and the people and families and tenants and childcare providers that we serve. What policies were impacting them or were on the horizon to impact them, and what role could we play in addressing that or taking a position on it. We also really needed to evaluate what issues were relevant to our organization, or where we could really take a stand. With so many different issues at hand, we really needed to decide what it was that we were going to advocate for, what we were going to take a stand on. And that was really evaluating our mission, our goals, and whether or not our current programs even had the capacity to include advocacy as a means. And because of the work that we do at Chicano Federation with affordable housing and subsidized childcare, nutrition, early childhood education, obviously those were enough to keep our advocacy platform pretty busy prior to COVID, but COVID just threw it to it added a whole different dimension that I don't think any of us were expecting. And I do see some questions coming across. Let's see, how did you make your decision to continue to work with the city in spite of the systemic concerns in our communities regarding Southeast and the Chicano communities? That's a great question. And so I'll get to that question. I just wanted to make sure I read it before it goes off the screen. So I will definitely talk about that, because that's a great question. And then to collaborate, right? So we are very intentional about the partners that we choose to collaborate with, because of the work that we're trying to do in establishing ourselves not just as a service organization, but also as an advocacy organization. And I think it goes without saying that we want to align with other nonprofits, other businesses that share in our mission. And I talked about this a little bit earlier today, that we even had to make the decision about which corporations we would no longer accept funding from, because their mission and values didn't align with ours. And that's a tough decision for any nonprofit to make, but particularly if we're going to be speaking out on issues, for example, on workers' rights, we can't be taking funding from a corporation that doesn't value workers' rights or has a history of, doing things that don't align with our mission. So that's also something that we very closely evaluate, is who we will accept funding from, and looking at the history of the decisions that they've made and how it aligns with our values. Assess the skills, identify goals and opportunities. I've kind of touched upon that. And then focus, that's a great one. So we often get approached to speak out or address or support all sorts of different issues. And sometimes it can be easy to try to be all of that. So we've tried to be very intentional about only speaking out on the issues that we feel directly align with our mission, and not speaking out on the issues that we're not necessarily in the position to speak out on. And so we have, when we get asked to do interviews or media on certain topics, we have pushed them over to some of our partners and said, hey, actually this person would be a much better person to speak on this, or they'd be much better to take a stand on this. Because I think it's important that we really define the areas in which we advocate for. So getting back to the question about kind of aligning with government, or still working with government entities, despite some of the mistrust and some of the past practices. This is something that we're very careful about in terms of who we align ourselves when it comes to elected officials or certain people that don't align with our values and mission. And I think that there's a fine line between kind of rejecting all of the government entities and knowing that we sometimes have to work within the system. And so I think that's also, for me, the difference between, advocacy and activism is sometimes you have to work within the system, and sometimes you have to work outside of the system, and there's a balance between the two. And as much as we are aware of the history and some of the practices that have been done in the past, we also know that in order to make some of these systemic changes that we need to make, we have to work within the system. And I think that's a balance that every organization and every leader needs to strike. And sometimes, truth be told, there's certain people and certain organizations that maybe, we would rather not align with, but we keep the end goal in mind. And with us, it's always to elevate our community and fight for the policies that impact their lives. And we have to strategize about what is the best way to do that. And sometimes it is working within the system, and sometimes it is aligning with government agencies. So I think that's a decision that is not just a personal one from a leadership standpoint, but also going back to your organizational values. So for example, for us, we receive government funding. We receive state and federal funding for some of the programs that we run. And while I recognize that I wish that wasn't the case, I also recognize the value in doing that because, so for example, our subsidized childcare, that comes from the state. But within that program, if a family comes to us and is in need of subsidized childcare, because we recognize that the cost of childcare in San Diego is prohibitive to working families who want to work, who want to go to school, if within that structure, within that program, we can work with the family to help them get or parents to help them get the skills and resources that they need to get a higher paying job, if we can work within the system to help them get a better education, if we can work within the system to get, help them make a career change, then that's what we'll do. And it's almost using the system to elevate our families. And it, unfortunately or unfortunately, that's what's at our disposal to do, but making the most of it so that we're not perpetuating this cycle of poverty and that we're really using what we have available to empower and support the families that come to us for our programs in particular. I hope I answered that question. Next slide. So lobbying, right? This is sometimes in the nonprofit world, it's not seen as a favorable word. So lobbying usually involves actions that directly support or oppose specific legislation and encourages the people to do the same. And lobbying often includes attempts to influence decision makers and lawmakers. And so I certainly won't get into kind of the distinction between lobbying and advocacy and kind of what level of lobbying is allowed for nonprofits. There is a certain degree of lobbying that nonprofits can do, but I would never want this to be misconstrued as kind of advice on what to do. So I encourage anyone who is not sure if something's crossing the line or not sure if that's within the realm to seek out support. And there are a lot of free resources for nonprofits that will help you make that determination. And at the end of this, I believe we list some in this PowerPoint. But just know that lobbying is not completely off limits for nonprofits. There is a limit to the amount and the type of lobbying that we can do. But again, I would really encourage you, if that's something that you're interested in, to take advantage of some of these free resources for nonprofits. We certainly did. We had hours of consultation with other C3s and other C4s to kind of determine what the balance was that we wanted to strike for our organization. Next slide. So effective advocacy requires obviously a balanced approach of identifying the right audience, which is key. Who are we trying to reach? And communicating your message clearly to tell a compelling story and show people how to respond. And like I said, while there's limits to lobbying and activism a nonprofit engages in, effective advocacy balances all three: lobbying, activism, and advocacy. And I think it goes back to kind of those steps that we laid out, like really identifying your mission, your values, what you identify with, what issues really resonate with you, and what you as an organization or as a leader want to take a firm stand on. And I will add that before I make the decision about, or before our organization makes a decision about what to support, we do always go to our board of directors. We discuss, we're being asked to support this measure or this initiative. We discuss the pros and cons, obviously always discuss who's for and against, and then collectively make that decision about whether or not it aligns with Chicano Federation's values before we will decide to support anything. Next slide. Again, another quote, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking that they don't have any. And again, this, I think, really recognizing the collective power that we have, but also understanding that within the realm of nonprofits, especially here in San Diego, when I think of how many nonprofits we have, how many active nonprofits, and how many really amazing nonprofits doing great work, I always reflect on the collective power that we all have to drive some of this change. Some of this social change. Okay, next slide. So social change during COVID and how this has, COVID-19 and this current pandemic has really reshaped not only how we deliver services, but also I think it's put nonprofits at the forefront of advocacy efforts. It certainly did for us. And not just in looking at how, for us, how Latinos were affected by COVID-19 and really how communities of color were, but also to really start speaking out on ensuring that the recovery from this pandemic is equitable and that it does provide the most impacted communities with the resources that they need. And I'll talk about a couple of examples of that. So for, going back to Chicano Federation, we spoke out about the impact of COVID-19 on the Latino community and how disproportionately the Latino community was affected by COVID-19 infections and death and unemployment. And this wasn't by accident, right? This was years of structural and systemic racism and discrimination that was playing out before our eyes. And so again, when we talk about working within the system and working out of the system, one of the things that came as a result of this was that we did partner with the County of San Diego in order for us and our coalition of 9 other nonprofits to start doing some of this outreach work for the Latino community to really educate them on prevention, on testing, on contact tracing, and now a vaccine or potentially a vaccine. But part of the reason that we chose to partner with the County of San Diego is that we, along with our partners, we understood that we were a trusted resource. That when some of that information came from a government entity, and we understand that there's already a level of mistrust there, that it wasn't going to be as well received as if we, as a nonprofit group and a coalition, were offering this same information. So again, and I think that's a great example of activism and advocacy and how it worked out, and that there's some ways in which we went against the system, but other ways in which we're working within the system for something that's in the betterment of our community in terms of being able to get them the information and the resources that they need. Okay, I see a question. I hear from people and nonprofits who are wanting to support social movements like Black Lives Matter, but are weary because of with politics, conflation with politics. Yeah, so this is that's a great topic, and one I could talk about all day. In fact, maybe that's what my presentation should have been on. So it was interesting when kind of some of the protests first started, and we started seeing the statements come out in support of Black Lives Matter, and some of them were very careful. And I think there was that feeling of not wanting to kind of cross over into activism or not cross over into saying something that wasn't not politically correct, but maybe socially correct. And what's interesting to me is I've had a number of nonprofit leaders reach out and say that they actually received backlash from their teams about not responding strong enough and not responding fast enough. And to me, that speaks volumes to this younger generation and really what they see they're capable of and what they're expecting from their leadership. So I think while some nonprofits were very careful, I think that the result was that the response from their teams encouraged them to do more. And that's encouraging to me. This younger generation gives me so much hope that things can get better and things can change. And so I will say that that's within every organization's kind of limits that they set for themselves and for every leader, and how strongly you want to come out in support of anything. And I'll share with you, there's going to be backlash sometimes. I've made decisions in supporting certain things that in hindsight, I thought, oh, okay, maybe that wasn't a great idea, or maybe I could have done that differently. But that's part of the journey, is that we're never going to be 100% perfect on the things that we support. And I think that there's supporting the Black Lives Matter movement has been a great learning experience particularly for the nonprofit industry. And that we did see a lot of statements of support come out, but what was missing from a lot of them was the action that needed to go with it, right? And I say this a lot, is that activism and advocacy are not about the way that you feel, it's about the things that you do and the actions that you take. And so it's one thing to put out a statement of support, it's another thing to make the internal changes and support the policies and support the things that are going to really advance that particular subject, in this instance for the Black Lives Matter movement. But again, I think that this is all a learning experience for all of us, particularly for nonprofits that are service providers and don't typically come out in support of certain movements. I think that this has been a great time for us to learn kind of what we all stand for, what our nonprofits stand for, and the risks that we're willing to take, because sometimes it is a risk. Okay, next slide. So yeah, I wanted to share with you some of the wins, some of the things that have happened during COVID, and some of the things that we've seen take place, because I think it is important to celebrate the wins and the recognition of the work that has happened not just as a result of our organizations, but this took a lot of work from a lot of different organizations, from coalitions, and most important, from community members. I shared earlier how we have seen community members come out and speak up for these issues has been so inspiring and really so heartwarming. And motivating in the work that we do to keep going and to keep doing more, because our community is listening, they're activated, and they want change. So one of the things that obviously we all know that live here in San Diego is the eviction moratorium that was approved in the city of San Diego and the county of San Diego. That came as a result of people really advocating for that, about speaking out, about calling in, and making sure that our elected officials knew how important this was. There's also the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 in communities of color. This led to investments into communities and funding for outreach. So I talked a little bit about how we partnered with the county with our 9 nonprofit partners to do some of this advocacy or this outreach work. But there was also other organizations that have also partnered to do this outreach work. And I think that one of the things that COVID-19 has shown us is how important nonprofits are to San Diego, and the work that we do, not just during a pandemic, but all the time. And the trust that we have earned in communities is invaluable. And I hope that if nothing else, this pandemic has shown that to our elected officials and really elevated the work of the nonprofit industry, because we have been instrumental in not just the work during this pandemic, we will be in the recovery. The other thing that we saw is, increased access to childcare for essential workers in San Diego County. So for those of you who were not aware, so we operate a lot in childcare space. We work with family childcare homes across the county and supporting the childcare providers that run their own businesses in their homes. And these are essential workers most of whom stayed open during this entire pandemic. And if any of them are listening, my hat goes off to them. They've just been phenomenal during this entire pandemic, taking care of children of our essential workers that needed to be, in the grocery stores and hospitals. So childcare providers is something that we very strongly support and advocate for. And so we did, the county invested $5 million, and then the city matched that again, but it took a lot of advocacy efforts from community members to really raise the issue and get the city of San Diego to match the county's $5 million investment for a total of $10 million for the childcare sector that supported essential workers receiving childcare during the pandemic. Next slide. Okay, and then there was the allocation of $25 million in funding from the county to provide childcare providers with stipends to ensure they remained open during this pandemic. This just recently happened, and this was a huge win for childcare, because as we know, a lot of childcare providers have suffered from the pandemic in terms of not being able to get income because people weren't going to work, and then therefore they weren't taking their children to childcare. And so this was great relief for the childcare sector and for childcare providers. But again, this would not have happened had the community not all come together to really advocate for this. And so we organized childcare providers for our organization. It was all women of color, and to speak at the Board of Supervisors meeting to advocate for this funding. And it was very, the word powerful is an understatement, but to see women of color and these these small business owners advocating and really speaking out at the Board of Supervisors meeting was something that to me will probably go down as one of my all-time favorite advocacy moments. And it resulted in a win. They got the $25 million. It was an application process, and I believe that funding is starting to be issued now. And there was also advocacy efforts to pass rent relief in the city of San Diego. So again, we helped along with a number of other partners to advocate for $65 million, which ended up being $25.1 million of funding. So again, while it wasn't exactly what we all wanted, it was something, and definitely there's a need for more, and that's something that we saw very clearly, but still a win for, on the advocacy front. And it really just, again, exemplified the power of nonprofits and coalitions and community members all coming together and what we can accomplish. Next slide. All right, lessons learned. All right, so I think first and foremost is be bold. We had kind of been dabbling in some of the advocacy efforts, but no one really started listening until we decided to be really bold with our statements and our efforts and the things that we were saying and the things that we were advocating for. And again, sometimes that's scary. And I do remember thinking like, oh, should we do this? Should we not? And kind of agonizing over some of these decisions. But in the end, this is our time. This is our time to be bold. This is our call to action as leaders, as nonprofits. This isn't a time to be careful or, just take baby steps. We need reform, we need change, and we need to fight for our communities. Coalition work is exhausting. It is, but it's so important and it's so powerful. And, I've mentioned it a number of times that coalitions can be a strong tool in advocacy. But it can be challenging. And, just knowing that going in, I think is really helpful. And I think it's also, again, helpful to be strategic about the coalitions that you align yourself with or that you form, and making sure that they're nonprofits that align with your values and goals, but also that they're leaders that you are able to work with and that you work well with. And then leveraging technology. So, social media is a huge platform in the way that people communicate now. And I think we've seen an increase since COVID-19 and people being home. But social media is a really interesting tool to get a message out. I think it can be both, it can be really helpful, but it can also be a detriment sometimes in thinking that social media is advocacy. While it is one form, definitely there's the action piece that needs to come with it. So, putting out statements on social media is one thing, but following up with the real action behind that is another thing. So that's one part of technology. The other one is that, now that everything's gone virtual, our elected officials and our government has in some ways become far more accessible to the general public. And one of the things that we were talking about internally is the city council and the board of supervisors meetings and how they've been overwhelmed with public comment. And I'm sure a lot of you have either heard or even tuned in or even participated in that, and how that's been really interesting to see. And is that a change that should continue in terms of having these meetings all be virtual so that more people can participate and that there can be more engagement with not just these meetings, but with our elected officials? And then, obviously uplifting community voices and always listening to community. I think this is key in everything that we do, is making sure that we're not speaking for a community, that we're listening to them, and then just really being the platform to elevate their voices. Because community knows exactly what they need. They know exactly what they want. We just have to be willing to listen. We just have to be willing to ask the questions, and then we have to be willing to take action. And then be intentional about your advocacy. And I think I've shared this, like really defining what you want to support as an organization and as a leader. Because, I mentioned this before, we get asked to speak out on a lot of different things. And we don't on a lot of different things, right? We are very intentional about what we will speak out on, what we will support, and what we will pass over to a partner who's in a better position to speak on that. Next slide. Takeaways. All right, so I think takeaways for all of us is, and I've talked about this, is that nonprofits can be effective advocates. While there are, certain limits that exist under the 501c3 regulations, there are a lot of ways that nonprofits can advocate and engage in lobbying. One of our favorite resources is boulderadvocacy.org. And we actually met with them, a while ago when we first kind of started on our route. and got a lot of really great advice on advocacy versus lobbying, what we can do, what we can't do. So I encourage you, if you have any questions, that is a wonderful resource. It's boulderadvocacy.org. I think the other takeaway would be that nonprofits can be bold and outspoken. And again, this is a time where we can't shy away from taking bold action and really being vocal about the injustices in our community. I mean, if you think about the reason that most nonprofits exist, it is because there are injustices in our community. And so, you know, we can speak out about those versus just providing services and programs. There's a whole different level of policies and advocacy and change that needs to come with that. Programs and services are not enough. We need to address the systems that got us here in the first place, and nonprofits can play a key role in doing that. Advocacy is more than just a hashtag or a statement. So my team helped me put this PowerPoint together, and so I love the little messages that they've thrown in here. It is, like I said, social media can be really helpful, but that's not enough, right? So just adding hashtags or making statements, that's a great start. But also, you know, we really need to think about what is the action that can come from that, whether it's within the system, out of the system, whether it's people-oriented, whether it's policy-oriented. There's a lot of different levels to this, and again, a lot of intersection between the two. But I think it's being really strategic about what that looks like for each organization. And then doing the work and knowing your audience, I think, is key as well. And again, none of this, I would encourage that none of this be done without the influence and opinion of your board, because they will be key in helping to drive this or helping to support this. So, you know, board of directors are obviously a huge part of this that can't be overlooked. A lot of these decisions, I guess it varies for each organization, but I know, like I mentioned, for us, there's nothing that I will support without first getting my board's buy-in, because it's important for me to have that, and it's important for them to know what Chicano Federation is talking about. So I would never want them to get a question about, oh, I saw Chicano Federation is supporting this, and they had no idea. And sometimes that might happen because, as we all know, things move very, very quickly, but I try to be very intentional about making sure that they are aware about the things that we're speaking out on and taking a stand on. And there will be losses. Yes, there will be losses. There will be advocacy efforts that are not successful. There will be efforts that go down in flames, for lack of a better word. I guess I shouldn't say that in California. It's a touchy subject right now, but there will be losses. And I think the important part is to really learn from those and learn what could have been done differently, how, you know, the strategy that could have gone along with that, and coming back better and stronger. But we have seen some some losses in our advocacy efforts, and it's important to just pick yourself up and reshift your strategy and really rethink about the direction that you want to go and what you can learn from that. Next slide. And then this is my all-time favorite Cesar Chavez quote, is that once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. And so I would love to, I think I talked kind of fast, would love to hear if anybody has any questions, any thoughts, any ideas, comments. I'll definitely open it up and be a little bit more aware of anything that's coming through. But I would love to share with you that this has been a really incredible journey for our organization, for Chicano Federation, and that it's been, for me as a leader, not just kind of a dream for me to be able to be the face and be the lead of this organization, but to really support a team who values our community and is so invested in our community and ensuring that we're doing everything that we can to uplift their voices, to support them, to encourage them, So if any of my team's watching today, I really just want to commend the work that they have all done, and really just continue to support and encourage them to continue doing this work, because it's not easy. And it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, and it can be frustrating, especially when there's losses, or especially when you're fighting for something you so strongly believe in, and there's all this opposition against what you're fighting for, and it can feel sometimes a little bit, overwhelming. But I think the one thing that I would share with everyone is, don't feel helpless, because we're not. And I will say this, over and over and over, is that the collective power that we all have, I don't even think that we're fully aware of. And so, as the nonprofit industry in San Diego, I think that we still have not even, scratched the surface of the work that we can do in driving more change. And that's, for me personally, that would be my hope for the region, is that we do start to see more nonprofits get involved in advocacy and activism efforts, and start to come together as a sector to really push for the change that we all know we so desperately need, and to really address the systemic barriers that are in place. And if you tuned in this morning, Roxanne and I talked a lot about, we opened it up about talking about a recent op-ed that I wrote about the language that we use in describing communities, and how that's just one start. But as a sector, how we have work to do, and really, we haven't even reached our potential. And so that's exciting to me, to be part of this. Oh, yay. We gained a new fan. Thank you. Big fan of the work that you do, or well, let me see. Became a huge fan of Nancy Maldonado and her entire team at Chicano Federation. Thank you for your expertise and viewpoint. Thank you, Nicole. My team is amazing, and I hope that they're listening. And I appreciate your comment. And really just appreciate all the work that all of the nonprofits are doing in the region, and I hope that we can continue to work together. Let's see, thank you for your honesty and bringing the issues to the surface. Gosh, thank you guys. We obviously wouldn't be able to do this, all of the work that we do without the collaborations and the support from our community. So we're really grateful for that. And on that front, if there's anything that any nonprofits that are maybe tuning in, any questions that you have, or any work that you would want to support and you're really not sure how to go about that, we're here to help. Luckily, I have a chief strategy officer on my team who is wonderful at this type of work. And so we would encourage anyone that maybe is a little bit nervous to delve into this work, or, kind of like somebody alluded to earlier, is a little reluctant to take a stand on certain issues. Gosh, we'd love to share some of the lessons that we've learned in doing that. So please, anytime, reach out to our organization. We're here to help. We want to collaborate with other nonprofits and really help to be this change that we so desperately need. So again, if there's any other questions, I'd love to see them come through. And any comments, we'll welcome those too. So as I was saying from earlier today, Roxanne and I talked a lot about, where do we go from here as a nonprofit industry, and how we can continue to support the movements that are going on around us. And I think there's a lot of conversations to be had within the sector about, how we move forward together, the activism that needs to happen, the advocacy that needs to happen, but most importantly, how as a sector we can help drive this change. So would really love to work with any of the nonprofits that are listening and collaborate with all of you. And again, if nobody has any other questions or comments, I think that coming up next, you're going to have a very special surprise. So my understanding is that we have Cedrice Weber, who you may have seen on the last season of The Voice. and she's going to be performing. And unbeknownst to me, she's actually a local. She's from San Diego, so that's super cool. And so I know she's getting ready to do a performance. So I hope that you will stay tuned to hear her. And she's got a really cool setup too, so make sure you don't miss it. So again, thank you guys all so much for tuning in today. I hope that this was informative. I hope it was helpful, and I hope that you will continue to tune in for the rest of the day, because I know that there's a lot more yet to come. So please, I know you're tired, I know it's late in the day, but please stay tuned, because there's more informational sessions coming up that are going to be really great and really powerful. So thank you all again, and thank you for your time.